We see a direct connection, a statistical connection with epidemiological data. We see different implications like the collapse of systems and so on. But in order to protect the people and to reduce the negative impact at the moment that people experience, we have to focus also not only on mitigation, but of course on adaptation. That means how general infrastructure can adapt to this new situation, but also to be prepared for the future situation. So, in order to understand that, we need some facts. And one of these facts is that this has been also mentioned that more of 50% of the world population live in urban areas. But this is one important fact, but there are also some additional facts who are important. And we know that also 75% of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere take place in cities. So someone can now assume that the climate or the global warming issue that we experience in the last centuries is in reality an urban problem. But there is also some additional facts which are important, is that urban areas cover only 3%, approximately about 3% of Earth's surface. And this is, I think, something which we have to consider because this area is very small. That means we have here a concentration of the emissions, but we have here also a concentration of the negative effects in urban areas. But there are also some other facts behind, which we have here, is that if you look directly to the cities, and I would like to describe these differences between cities and rural areas with the Greek delta. And if you look on that, on the differences between cities and rural, we know that cities usually are about, in an annual basis, about 2 to 3 centigrade, which is quite a lot because the increase that we had in the last 150 years from climate change is about approximately, depending on the area where we are, geographical area where we are, about 1 to 1.5 centigrade. But this means, especially also for people who are living in cities, that in the future we will have an increase, and this is exactly what the climate models are providing us with data and information, that the increase of temperature or the rise of temperature will be about more than 3 centigrade, especially in the mid latitudes. That means in reality that people who are living at the moment in cities right now experience climate change. That means we know what happens and people can imagine it. The other point is that in the future, we will have 2 times climate change. That means one from urban areas, and one from global climate change. That means people who are living in cities have finally the exposure of 2 times. That means the situation is getting more worse in cities. The question now is that how can we understand what happens in the city? Why are cities much warmer than the surrounding? And here we try to characterize this based on the characteristics of the urban area, but also what are the energetic effects. Urban climatology and climatology mostly, when we want to describe something, we look about the energetic effects, what happens in terms of the energy exchange of the surfaces, or also what happens also concerning energy, evaporation, and so on in the atmosphere. So concerning the urban characteristics, we have some factors which we have to consider. First of all, we have the urban geometry. The urban geometry, or we can call it also urban morphology. First of all, we have the increased surfaces. That means we have more surfaces in urban areas. It's about 4 to 6 times more surface in comparison to the rural area. This increased surfaces in reality are vertical surfaces. And here, because of the urban canyon geometry that we can have multiple reflection of the sun radiation, which means the more reflection you have and the more surfaces you have the absorption of the radiation from the sun. That means this surface is heating up. But in addition to the reflection and the absorption, these surfaces cannot directly emit the radiation that they got from the sun because we have a limitation of the horizon. That means we have a lower free horizon, and that means that the radiation is captured in the urban canyons or in the urban morphology. And the third one factor concerning the morphology is that we have lower wind speed because we have here a different turbulent heat exchange. Of course, we have also more higher roughness. The second important factor that we have is that we have in cities emission of air pollutants, and these air pollutants have the they have a higher atmospheric radiation. That means more pollutants in the air, more particles in the air, more gases in the air, and they have the temperature. That means we have here more radiation. The third factor that we have is not the morphology of the city, but the materials that we have in the city. And we have also not only the materials, I'm sorry, here it has to be the emission of heat of the buildings and the burning processes. And then we have here a higher induced heat. The fourth factor that we have is the building materials. And these building materials have different characteristics and different properties and physical and chemical properties. That means they can store the heat that happened during the day, and this heat is remaining during the night. And then finally, because of the building materials, we have, of course, less evapotranspiration. If we look now on the 7 factors that we have here and want to quantify why cities are warmer, and we use here the approach of the urban heat island. In reality, it's not an island, but there are many and more islands in the city. We see that the most important factor is, let me say, the less effective radiation. That means the urban morphology and the capture of the sun, of the radiation there, and finally the physical properties of the materials. That means the geometry, the building, or the aspect ratio, width to height of streets and height of buildings are the factors who are affecting that. In the tropical area, there's an additional factor which has a huge role or plays an important role. This is the heat emission from buildings and burning processes. But mostly, if you take over the world, what is the most 2 important factors is really the lower free horizon, the capture of radiation, and the heat storage, mostly of the buildings. We can see this also in a different way when we want to analyze. This is a different way of demonstration or visualization of the previous graph that I show or table. We see that rural is a 2-dimensional surface, cities are 3-dimensional, and in reality, cities consist from buildings and vegetation. And we have here a higher complexity. And we have different futures of these configurations, and they have different characteristics. As I mentioned before, we have the morphology, we have the air pollutants, We have the heat emission, of course, traffic and so on, and we have the building materials and surfaces. We see in reality four important factors. As I mentioned before, the first one and the last one are the most important in the formation of the urban heat island. Finally, or in reality, also for the formation of the urban climatology, because urban heat island is not urban climatology, it's only urban heat island, it's only a part of that. And we can explain the urban heat island based on energetic aspects and also about the physical properties that we have there and morphology. And the question is now how to quantify that. What possibilities we have, except the energetic aspects, what kind of ways we have to analyze this to see that. That means we can define a target. And the target that we can define here is, of course, because as I mentioned before, most of the people live in urban areas and the target can be the humans. This is the topic that we have. Let me summarize the introduction. We have the global warming, which is the climate change, and we know that most of the people live in urban areas. We have to focus, or we focus mostly on the urban areas. That means because of the increase or the change of the parameters, mostly climate parameters, we have an effect of heat. Of course, mostly because of the extremes and not about the annual warming. And one of the most factors where we know a lot about it and we know how to deal with that nowadays and also in the future. We don't know everything about that, but we know enough in order to apply and develop possibilities of protection and develop warning systems is the issue of heat. And heat has take an important role in the in let me say in the discussion about global warming at the moment. Heat, hot, and health, which is heat in the city. You see here a picture from the Global Heat Health Information Network, which is has been formed about nearly about 5 6 years ago, and we are focusing here in the quantification of heat, but not only on the scientific quantification, but also how to communicate this. Heat in a city is one issue. The other one issue is heat in a workplace, because we have vulnerable population groups who are exposed more than other groups, population groups, on heat. And then we have specific events like soccer games or football games, where not only, let me say, the athletes are affected, but also the fans or the spectators. That means one of the issues at the moment that many groups worldwide are working on it is the quantification of heat waves. And I would like to show you the possibilities how to quantify that and then present you some specific examples. We know that in reality, when we are looking about the effect of the atmosphere or in general of the environment on humans or on human health, we cannot focus only on one parameter or one factor. Most of the time, people think that temperature is the most important factor. That's true. Temperature is one of the most important factors in order to quantify the effect of the changes in the atmosphere, but we have also some other factors like humidity, like wind speed, but also radiation. And when we know that we have a similar way of implication or similar way of the effect, we can bring this together in components or complexes in order to quantify that. As mentioned in the beginning, I will focus only on heat and the thermal component. How we are doing that? We try to assess that not only on air temperature, but also on other factors like humidity, wind, and radiation. But in order to have an overall approach or a comprehensive approach for the quantification, because the target point in this case is the human body. We need also some information from thermophysiology, mostly in the studies that we are running or are running worldwide, is the inclusion of activity and clothing. That means the metabolism and the change of behavior of the humans. And we use here the approach of the energy balance of humans. That means we approach or see the human as an ancient who is always trying to keep the temperature of the human body, which is about 37 centigrade, to keep it in a stable condition. And every deviation of that provides difficulties or problems in the case of cold, but also in the case of heat. In order to approach that, we use the concept of thermal indices, which are nothing else than equivalent temperature, is in reality the real field temperature. That means it's not only temperature, but the overall effect of all other information that I have mentioned before here in this transparency. And here we use this concept of this equivalent temperatures. Based on that, on questionnaires, on epidemiological analysis, we can bring this, let me say, synthetic temperatures in relation to the thermal sensitivity, but also to the grade of physiological stress. For Middle Europeans means that 18 to 23, everything is fine, there is no thermal stress. And this is, of course, not valid for all the people in the world. But when we are going more to the hot area, we see that there are not so much differences between the mid latitudes and or in the tropics. That means when we want to quantify heat, we have a natural limitation, which is the skin temperature and the core temperature. And the core temperature, as I mentioned before, is about 37. That means the closer we are getting to this thresholds, the more implications we can see or we have. There is a theoretical background behind. As I mentioned before, we use these 4 parameters for meteorology: the insulation and the heat production of the human body. And we describe this and try to keep this in a balance. That means every deviation from the balance means there is a thermoregulation has to work more intensively in order to keep cool. The concept of that, of this modern thermal indices, is, and I take here the one example, which is the physiologically equivalent temperature, is one of the most used indices in the world. We have other, like the perceived temperature, the Universal Thermal Climate Index, or the modified physiological equivalent temperature. What are they doing? We expose the human body in the real conditions. We make the calculations for the gravity center of the human body, which is 1.1 meter. And then we calculate here the core temperature, skin temperature, the energy fluxes, transpiration, sweat, and all this additional information that is existing. And then we transfer this result from skin temperature and core temperature in the indoor environment with specific clothing and specific activity of the human body, and see at what air temperature is this similar. That means at what temperature we have all this negative, or let me say, all these outputs from the calculation. And that's what we get indoors, because it is easier for every human to quantify the conditions indoors and outdoors. And as I mentioned before, for mid latitudes, especially, the calculations that we made and the analysis that have been made in Western and Middle Europe, PET of 20 centigrade means thermal comfort. And in order to get this information, you need some standardizations, which is the clothing and the activity, the information about meteorology, and the concept that we have in the physiological equivalent temperature. It's at the moment, I would say, a simple model. Of course, we have more complex model, but we need models which can be calculated very fast. And as mentioned before, between 18 to 23 in Europe means no thermal stress. If you want to apply this kind of grades or tables for other areas, it has to be done an adjustment. And we have several adjustments run in the last 15 years. If you're interested about that, which is the most, let me say, appropriate thermal index, there's a paper which is free available on Atmosphere. And we know that finally, in order to analyze that kind of indices, or if you want to analyze meteorological data and information, PET, perceived temperature, UTCI, and SET star are the most appropriate, and also the further development of PET, which is the modified PET. But at the moment, we are running all the validation analysis for that. But in reality, it can be directly applied for that. There are also several studies working with PET. And all these indices, and this is the advantage of them, require the same input data, and they can be calculated. If you want to make the measurements for that, it's very complex. You need something like a meteorological station. You see here a picture, and the most difficult in that is not to get temperature and relative humidity, but the most difficult is to get radiation, because, and this is the difference to the rural area energy balance, that the human body is three-dimensional. That means you need all the radiation fluxes of all directions. Finally, you need, in reality, 6 measurements about shortwave radiation, that means radiation from the sun, and also radiation from terrestrial, that means from the surrounding, from the air, and so on, in order to calculate that. Of course, this is not so easy to do that, but we have other possibilities in order to do that with mobile measurements. This is a very traditional approach developed more than 30 years in Germany, in Munich. And in this example is here from Freiburg. But we have also the possibility, in order to get all this information, to run models. In reality, we apply here microscale models, and these microscale models can run hypothetical data, meteorological data, but most of these models have the possibility to, that data can be imported on manually input in the model in order to get this information. The models that you see here are mostly free available. 2 of these models have been developed at my lab, first at the university, then at the German Meteorological Services. One of the most known models, let me say, which is more a point model, but is also developed in order to run simulations for a long time. Other models can run simulations only for 1 day, and take this as an example, is the Raman professional model. And I will try today to show you some results from the Raman model. As I mentioned before, these models are free available, can be downloaded, can be used for education in lectures, but also for analysis. That means we have the possibility to quantify that. We have a fantastic method, which is the human energy budget of the human energy budget. We have the possibility of quantifying the effect. Doesn't matter if it's thermal comfort, cold stress, or heat stress. This is for the full range of for the full spectrum of meteorological and climatological conditions. And this concept of the equivalent temperature is something relevant and something interesting. And we have tools in order to run that. As I mentioned before, there are more than 4 models. I only listed here the 4 most known models. I would like to show you some examples where we can apply that kind of models. And my focus will be not only on a comprehensive scientific analysis, but also I will try to focus also on communication possibilities, what we can apply and how can we apply. First of all, I would like to present you a very popular example, which is the FIFA 22, which will take place next year. And as we know, when we look about events, we mostly the question is to focus on the athletes, And but we don't have only athletes who have in reality to do hard work like playing football or running marathon, but we have also the officials. We have but also spectators. And in order to do that, I would like to show you a little more long story starting in the year 2014. And there has been in the mass media, especially in the Los Angeles Times, uh, a report about a paper which I will show you as next. And the title of this, not interview, but of this information was in the part of LA Times Science, uh, scientific proof that the Summer World Cup in Doha is too hot for fans. We try to make an analysis and we try to apply the approach, or we applied the approach as show you before. And you see in the graphs in the upper part, in the on the left side, you see first temperature. On the right side is the physiological equivalent temperature, the real field temperature, as I mentioned before, for all the year. And here we have the separation of the months in three parts. That means 10 days, 10 days, and the rest of the month in order to have a more comprehensive approach about analyzing more detailed analysis when people are going for holidays or spending time abroad in another area, because this is mostly about 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and so on. In the lower panel, we see the daily pattern. That means the change over the year and what happens during day and night. And so if we focus on the upper part, we see that temperature and PET are quite different. We have a similar pattern, but we see that the temperature in Doha, especially at the time when the game had to be take place, was about June, July. For the FIFA games, we see that the temperature here is about the maximum is about 40 to 45. But when we look about the PET, we see that the temperature is much higher than the air temperature. And the lower graphs that we have here, we see a more detailed analysis concerning the pattern during the day. And we see that during the day, the conditions are too hot in order to, let me say, to have some activities. And to be honest, we didn't focus this on the effect on the athletes, but we focused this on the spectators. That means on regular people, on the fans who will go there in order to watch the games. This paper has been published 2014 in the summer. That was the first, let me say, the online paper, and officially published some months later. But this got in the media. It was in the media everywhere in the world except Germany, and there have been a controversy. The organizers of the FIFA in Qatar contact us and said they want more detail and so on. And we had the possibility in the Urban Climate newsletters, which is a small journal from the International Association on Urban Climatology, to have something like a controversy, the opinion of the science, but also of the opinion of, let me say, of the organizers. And they say we can cool everything. And there have been a strong controversy and discussion about that. And I would like to summarize that. Our suggestion in the paper was transfer the games to the winter. In summer, it's too hot, especially for the people who are not adapted and coming from another or more mild area or cold area in order to watch the games. And the contra of the organizers was we can cool everything. 6 months later, after the publishing of the paper, there was also some other one or two papers related to that. FIFA transferred the games in the winter, and as you know, the games now will be in the winter. And we had, based on that, 7 years ago, diverse reactions and perceptions. One of these reactions was, especially from people from science and architecture, and they said, uh, what about energy consumption? What about the prices of the games? I mean, the tickets and so on. After this publishing this paper, some time later, I think that was 2018, the World Athletics contacted me, and we had several meetings because Doha didn't have experience at that time, uh, let me say, outdoor games. And the World Athletics 2019 took place end of September, beginning of October. And you can imagine what happened there. We had the collapse of several athletes. I had yesterday afternoon a meeting with the World Athletics, and we decided to reanalyze these games to see what happened there and what can we modify there. And we find out that, and especially the marathon took place during the night, not during the day. We had the collapse of several athletes. And the final opinion was everyone was loser in the World Athletic Championship in Qatar. I was also there, but was one of the most worst experiences that I made in my life because it was very hot for me, especially. And and then based on that, and before the games in Qatar, we talked with the Olympic IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and we talk also about that. What will be happening in Tokyo? I don't want to talk about the story that the games have been shifted for 1 year, and we find out that similar things can happen. And based on the experience that we had in Qatar, the transferring the games from summer to winter and the negative implications on the athletes, especially on the women that we had there, they finally decide. We analyzed also several conditions about Tokyo, and finally the 50-kilometer walking and the marathon have been transferred or placed to Sapporo, to another city. Uh, this events issue is a very wonderful example to show that science can in reality do something not spectacular, but something valuable. I have a second example from Freiburg. This is more related now to cities. Is the transformation of spaces. There's a specific space in Freiburg, and people are familiar with this area. It was, let me say, something like a green area there, and this area has to be transformed. You see here the picture. This green area that you see in the picture, more in the middle of the upper picture, is surrounded by several colleges of the university, the theater of the city, and the university library. And the place has to be transformed. It was a competition. This was the winner. The winner, the architect, suggested a place with sandstone plates, removing most of the trees. And you can imagine that there was something like a revolution in the city. The people don't want it. That they have been pro and contra about the modification or transformation of this space. One group said it will be so hot we will have a back oven here or people will die. The other group said, especially the municipality, we have to transform the space because it has to be a multifunctional space and so on. And then there have been several, for years, discussions and exchange between the different NGOs, the different groups who have been interested in the transformation. And we see here in this picture a possibility here or a suggestion from the newspaper, from the local newspaper, who took the old place and left all the old trees there, put also some additional trees in order to have, let me say, a more green area. There are some limitations about the space because under this space there is a garage. That means for cars and so on. It's not so easy to plant more trees in reality. The space has been transformed, has been opened 2017. It was a very hot day there. The people suffer there, and what we made in order to quantify that, some members of my group analyzed all these conditions based on meteorological data, and we try to quantify the effect of radiation. We focus in this case only on radiation. And there was a specific tree there, which has a height about 12 meters. The trunk was about, or the crown had a diameter of 6 meters. The trunk was about 5 to 6 meters with no crown. And this tree had to be removed. Finally, it has been removed, and we analyzed this tree to see what will be happen in terms of the heat of PET higher than 35 before and after, and we find out that we will have an increase of 125 hours a year. This is not 5 days; it's about 3 times more because we took all the situation during the day. And based on that, finally, the place has been open, as I mentioned, but the amount of tree is the same. Some trees have been removed, but some other trees have been planted. And there was a strong discussion about that about 7 to 8 years. And finally, we can conclude that the environmental pressure makes sense. In reality, we expect something, but we get something different. It was interesting that 3 days after the opening of the space, there was a cold front passing with a storm, and one of the trees have been damaged, or part of the tree has been damaged. And the question is now how people adapt and adjust in their experiences and or in their perceptions. This takes very fast place. But at the moment, I can say finally both sides are mostly happy. And if you pass this space during summer and winter, we see that there is always some, let me say, some human traffic. There are many people are exposed, especially there is more water there in order to cool it in summer and so on. I have mostly been asked about how the story goes on. Of course, we are working on this space, what possibilities we have to modify about shading devices, artificial shading devices. We made some simulations and we see that we can reduce more or improve the situation. This is also a wonderful example. And this example here especially is from Freiburg. I'm located in Freiburg. I'm familiar with the situation. That means here science can be more specific and can be implemented in decision, let me say, on the local level, but also on the regional level. The third example, what I have, is trees. What is the effect of trees? If we see on the positive and negative effect of trees, you see the green circles that we have here is the positive effect. We have also some negative effects that like damage to property, the maintenance and so on. But there is also another factor which is not included here, but I would like to focus on shade. We had in the year 2003 a very extensive heat wave in Western Europe. In summer 2003, we had additional human implications in mortality, more than 60,000 as usual. And the government in Munich, which is Bavaria, which is the state of Bavaria in Germany, asked us about the possibilities that we have to quantify or to see what is the effect of forests during heat waves on heat. And we see here a picture which show us the first 2 weeks in August is the x-axis, and the y-axis is the time that we have here. And we have measurements outside the forest, inside the forest. Outside is the left, and inside is the right picture that we have here. And we see in reality in temperature, there are not so during the day, not so much differences. It's about 2 to 3 centigrade, not more. But if we look on the perceived temperature or the real field temperature, we see that the differences are much higher, especially the differences are more than 10. That means it's about 2 physiological scales in thermal classification. During the night, the forest is maybe not the best solution. That during the night means it may be better to be outside because of the radiation emission and the cooling, it's quite better. But we have here the possibility to quantify this in terms of numbers. That means giving numbers and showing how much one tree can reduce heat, how a forest can reduce trees, what are the differences over all the year, and so on. This is also a wonderful example, but we have also, let me show you the final example that I have for you, is which is on the short-term adaptation or on short-term actions that we have, is the warning systems. I would like to show you how we generate the heat health warning systems in Germany, because we have a heat health warning system uh, which is part of the warnings in Germany, of several warnings, and we have the weather forecast. We take all the information from the weather forecast that we need: temperature, humidity, wind, and radiation. We take a human energy balance, which is the perceived temperature, and this perceived temperature is adjusted in terms of the seasonality. That means if a heat wave takes place earlier in the spring or early in the spring, is much more effective than later on. That means we have the, let me say, something like adjustment of heat or adaptation of people on heat. But we take also the information from an indoor model, because in Europe, especially, the people spend many time indoors, especially also during the night, because during heat waves, the night situation maybe is similar, equivalent, or similar important like the day situation. For me, it's more important for humans. We take an indoor model, we get automatically warning proposals. In this warning proposal, we justified at the research center in Freiburg, and then we can run the warnings. But we include also urban areas in the warnings, how much urban areas is warmer, but also specific information for elderly people, because elderly people, especially for extreme heat, are suffering more and quite earlier than younger people. And this information and this warnings that we release is based on that, how to say, on administration agreements with federal ministries in Germany. We have 16 counties in Germany, and we release these warnings for counties. We have 350 counties, and this information are available for smartphone applications with specific email newsletter, but also in the internet. And of course, this information are communicated in different ways. And there is, since about the more than 15 years, there is from WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, and WHO, a movement about the development of heat health action plans. They are still applied in several countries in the world. In Germany, we have at the moment a hype about that. And if we look on the factors which are included in the heat action plans, we see that number 2 is a precise heat health warning system with regional defined threshold, exactly what we have. But we see also that we have the indoor conditions, which we include also in the heat, but also the urban planning and construction industry. It's exactly the examples that I show you before, the first 3 examples that I show you. And we have, but also some more factors in order the heat action plans to be successful. They have to consider the interdisciplinary cooperation, the central coordination, to consider vulnerable groups, to consider the people who are working in the health sector, but also finally the evaluation and the monitoring of the actions that have been taken. I would like to summarize what happens about the management. As when I started my presentation, we were talking about urban climate, climate change, health, and focus on heat. And we have 2 kind of possibilities. We have the mitigation and the adaptation, and that means we need actions. And this action can be from short to long term. Long term is the buildings, the construction of spaces. Short term is the effects, the warning systems, the quantification of heat, and all this information that we get, and not to be only on qualitative manner, but also on a quantitative manner. A very important issue is the communication. And we find out when we talk about urban planning, urban design, and so on, that planners and climatologists talk about the same things but with different terms. This example that you see here is from Freiburg with a railway that is city railway or the tram, and this is a picture that one of the responsible lady from the urban planning department provided us, and she talks about several things. We talk about radiation, she talks about shade. We talk about wind, she talks about radiation. We talk about mobility or emission, and she talks about public transportation. That means we need ways of communication which considers the different way of thinking. And for the information transfer, we need also specific communication parts. I show this picture in the warning system. Now I would like to go more detailed in this picture. We have the heat health warning system, and we have different ways of transferring this information. For us, because we have the administration agreements with the ministries, is of course the ministries, let me say, top priority. But in reality, we provide the information also, let me say, for the care. That means people who need care, and this can be on the private level, it can be also on the official sector. We provide the heat health warnings. We provide in a very simple language, and when we have extreme heat, we consider also additional factors that enably help because the situation is getting more worse in that. I would like to summarize only the heat health warning system, which is a short action. But this warning system is in operation since 2005. It combines the building simulation model for the nocturnal information. We have two different levels. I forgot to mention that the thresholds that we use is based on mortality connections or statistical relationships with mortality. We have the information on county level for different elevations in the county, but also the duration of the heat waves. And we consider also elderly people in the cities. And my final statements for today are that we need adaptation possibilities. In reality, we need actions. The heat action plans is a very fantastic instrument that we have at the moment, which can be more or focus more on the short term. And in the short term, we need really good warning systems with a possibility of implementations, but also adaptations. And the long term can be, of course, the urban design, the greenery, and all these factors, also water areas in specific urban agglomerations and so on. But finally, and this is my personal opinion, is that all this information that we provide or want to provide should be communicated in a very easy, understandable way. And the target that at the moment we are focusing here is not only on communication, but also in education, especially from, let me say, the people who are working in the health sector. Thank you very much for listening. Efcharistopoli in my native language in Greek. And I'm now available for questions and exchange. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Andreas, for such a great presentation. So, in this presentation, you mentioned about the global warming, how the effect of the climate change and urban climate change to the health and heat production. So, I will move to the session, question and answer session. Maybe we can see from the Slido, please. So, okay, wait a second, Professor Andreas. So, you mentioned before that the heat in workplace also impact the athletes in competition and the supporter in the stadium in Doha. Yes. Actually, You hear my voice? Okay. Sorry for the technical problem. Yeah. So we will move first to the Slido. Okay. The first question.
Kecil banget tulisannya.
Excuse me.
Can you like
The
urban
urban morphology. Wait a second. I can see the slide. So, urban morphology, this is the question from Daniel. Urban morphology, I believe, able to reduce warming. What do you think we can contribute as an architect or urban planner to mitigate the heat stress? Pertanyaannya mana aja?
semangat. Semangat.
Much for the answer, Professor Andreas. So we will move to the second question from Beta. What is the most vulnerable impact of the heat stress for an athlete? How we can mitigate the heat stress from athletes where their met rate consider high? Metabolic equivalent. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So, continue with the next question. I read your research on the asymmetrical urban canyon in Cuba. I saw the results that have been classified based on HW ratio from Hans. Yes, please, Professor. So the second is sky view factor SVF as an indicator for you to consider the result too?
First question.
Next question still from Hans. Does this result only take samples from urban canyons whose HW ratio is determined from the ANVI map simulation result? Okay, thank you very much for the answer. So we will move to next question from Karisma. How is the current urban climate development after pandemic, and how to maintain the current decline so that it is that does not rise again as long as long-term solution?
To rethink about things that we have done before. I think this is a question which is under discussion, and we will discuss this for the next decades.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. What do you think about the global warming? This is the question from Cahya Rohman. What do you think about global warming, which is so difficult for human to overcome? What are the impacts of the global warming to athletes? And then how is the technology can solve the problem?
So I think we have two possibilities to reduce the global warming. The one is the reduction of the greenhouse emissions, but this is very important. This is mitigation. Mitigation has to take place, but in order to see the effect of mitigation, we have to wait for several decades. That means 30 to 50 years to see the reduction, how the reduction, when we will be carbon neutral or we have carbon neutrality, to see what happens. But the other point is adaptation. Adaptation here takes place much faster. As I mentioned before, the warning systems that we have, that people can adapt very easy. But in reality, in order to reduce the impacts, we need a change in the behavior. That means When it's hot, I stay home and I reduce my activity. And I don't go outside in order to make sports and so on. That means a change in behavior, nothing else.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Andrea. So, from the athletes' point of view, actually, several athletes they should come to the competition field a day before they have competition, so they can adapt. So, do you have any result of your research related with the how is the difference between the athletes that have already adapt with the temperature or the situation in the new competition field, and then before they move to the other place, something like that?
Of athlete and let me say what kind of sport this is. As far as I know from the World Athletics, it can be up to 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question come from no names. This is from Doni. So as urban designers, what should we do to plan the new urban areas besides planting trees to make the environment more comfort, especially in the tropical climate?
Hoping that someone will put this question, and I'm happy about that. The situation is that when you want to design a new area and you want to plant trees, you have to consider a specific approach. When you plant the trees, they will not directly provide shade and, let me say, positive effects. We run a simulation in the beginning of this year, and we run the simulation for our climate region, and we want to find out how much has trees to grow in order to provide, let me say, appropriate shade. And we find out that for specific trees in Germany, which is deciduous trees, here we have, it takes about 15 to 20 years to provide, let me say, good things. This is the one point. The other point is when planning new areas and planting trees, we have to look on providing and planting trees who are, let me say, familiar with the local and regional climate. This is the one point. And the other point is the amount of trees maybe is not the best solution, but we have to think about which is the best configuration and how many trees have been provided. It makes no sense to have an open area in the city and say, okay, I'm running here in urban forest.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is it any different between planting a trees and then use umbrella in the, okay.
Planting trees and using umbrella. Planting trees is, as I show in my presentation, the one table with the positive and negative effects of trees. You have more factors. Umbrella is good, let me say, for the short term. This is one point. The other point is umbrellas can reduce the sun, but they reduce also the UV radiation. And the reduction of the UV radiation because of the scattered radiation that we have is not so much that we have on trees, because trees have several layers and the umbrella have only one layer. So umbrella is for a specific case, going to the city for or going to the going for swimming and so on is maybe a good solution, but not, let me say, for a long-term solution. It's only short-term.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. So next question from Lucky. Indonesia is a tropical country that has high temperature and humid ambient. How to design a safe environment for sport in that condition?
It's a good question. How to design? It depends on the sport kind or on the sport that we have. But I think it has to be run more on shade, but also on the possibility to have a good ventilation. I think that kind of studies are still existing. I think there are some studies from Taiwan about that and so on, but I think a good combination of that. But also, as I mentioned before, maybe it's better to run to find out which is the most appropriate time of the year and the most appropriate time where we can avoid, let me say, the extremes, especially the heat extremes. I think we need basic studies about that. Uh, that kind of study we run, as we show for Doha, but also for the Olympic Games, not only considering heat stress, but also considering cold stress. Okay, you don't have in Indonesia cold stress, but also to focus when is the humidity much higher, what is about the wind, and so on. I think we need basic analysis in order to see. And here we need the uh, I would say the discussion and the exchange not only with climatologists and people from the environment, but also really people from sports medicine and general medicine and the administration.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. So, it's depend on the time when we do the exercise outside, maybe like the professor. Yeah. Okay. So, next question come from Lazwar D Hakim. Why are the action taken by reforestation mentioned in the long term? Why not in the short term? Reforestation.
Reforestation takes place in order to get all this, let me say, as mentioned before, to provide shade and all this additional, let me say, positive attitudes that we have from forests for humans, especially. They take time, as I mentioned before, to provide shade by a tree and forest. It take time. It's about 15 to 20 years. That takes time. So we have to look about long term. Of course, when we have the forest, then we have a short term. It's still existing action of forest, which is is in reality short term. That means reduces the heat. If you have an urban forest or a park and you go during the day in the park when it's hot, of course you have direct short term action.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Andreas. So, next question come from Daniel. What are the current existing barriers or constraints, especially on the city plan or local regulation on reducing the risk of heat stress?
I would like to provide you an example about that. The one is that the people who are, let me say, in the regulation or in the administration and taking decisions, most of them, they are not familiar with this issue. That means we need education in that. This is the one point. The other point is we need a common language. And the third point is we need or we have to avoid misunderstandings. But I think the most important issue in that is the communication. It has to be an easy, understandable communication. So if we have a meeting with people from administration or for planning, from city planning and so on, and we talking with a language which they don't understand, they will not be able to see that something has to be taken. We need, as I mentioned or I showed before, easy understandable examples. And we have to give them time to understand that.
Okay, thank you for.
More often, maybe every 4 weeks, in order to understand the topic, to have an exchange, to find common ground, and so on. And finally, the question is how we can implement all this information. And mostly, is the limitation is, of course, mostly because of financial aspects, or there are some other aspects that has to be considered. That means it has to be a weighting of the factors in reality.
Okay, so the call. Yeah.
Period.
Okay. So the collaboration may be needed in this field, right? So next question from Celia Putri. What are the effects that will be received by the human body, especially athletes, if affected by heat stress, and how to avoid that?
It has to be in reality are all this age that we have. I mean, the factors starting with age, heat stroke. I have a brochure here, and I hope you can see, which is also existing in English. It's also available online. Climate change and human health tips against heat and heat waves, and you can have heat cramps.
Yes.
Anything about heat, but most important for athletes, I think, is the heat collapse, because after the heat collapse is going uh, all the negative factors, and to be then in the hospital, and then finally to have, let me say, increase in the human mortality.
Yeah, so the condition of heat stress in the heat wave, heat stroke.
From climate. I'm from
Okay.
climate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Andrea. So, next, come to the next question from Muhammad Azril. In your opinion, what is the best way to continue the moderation and stop the bad impact of global warming at the same time?
Good question.
Dia udah mulai arel.
You can only decrease the effects.
Okay.
And as I mentioned before, in adaptation, you have a very fast, you see the result very fast, because if you have a good heat health warning system and you provide warnings and people will follow the recommendations, we will decrease, let me say, the effects, which is an adaptation reality. But concerning to stop, we need, of course, let me say, climate measures, climate protection, reduction of the emissions, but this needs time. You cannot see the effect direct now. And there's one fact that we can stop the global warming, but we can stop the global emissions, and we provide solutions how we believe in the future with the situation now and the expected situation in the future.
Okay.
But mostly, yes.
Okay. So, the I see. Okay. So, you mentioned before about the education. How about the curricular or pedagogy can contribute to the heat stress awareness?
To think about that, and I see this here in Germany. There is initiative called Alliance on Climate and Health, and behind this alliance, let me say, is the German Association of Medical Doctors, and they are focusing on appropriate and relevant communication. But this is one target of them. But the other target, what I started 2 years ago, is, if I remember well, is they focus really on the implementation of teaching. And this is a very we are at the moment concerning heat on an emergency situation. I think this has to be done fast. We have to start by the medical doctors, by the pharmacies, by, let me say, the people who are working in the healthcare and so on. And I think here we have to act. This is one possibility that I show you about the brochures. Yeah, there's one possibility. The other possibility is, as I mentioned before, is a neighborly help, and I think also to include in the curricula of all studies. I think we have to start concerning climate change, and let me say all about the extremes, and the extremes that we have is storms, we have flash floods, and also heat. I think we have to start very early in the school, and then continue in the studies, and also in the daily communication by media.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So next question come from Faiza Octavia. Is the greenhouse effect a natural process, and how does it work?
About one semester teaching every day. The first effect that we have is the natural greenhouse effect. In the natural greenhouse effect, if we count this in terms of temperature, is about 33 centigrade. That means if we will remove all the gases in the atmosphere who plays a role in the let me say in the greenhouse effect, we will have a reduction of 33 centigrade. That means the global temperature at the moment is 15, and if we decrease them, we will be finally at minus 18 overall the world. The biggest effect in the natural greenhouse effect is the vapor pressure, about 20 centigrade, and the CO2, about 9 centigrade. When we now talk about the greenhouse effect or the global warming, we don't talk about the 33 centigrade that we have at the moment, but we talk about the additional one, which is additional CO2, additional methane, additional ozone, additional other factors. And this, what we expect in the future, is about 3 to 5 centigrade globally, depending at what time frame we are looking, to the end of the century or later on and so on. That means, and you can imagine, you say, but it's only 3 centigrade. Yes, but 3 centigrade, if you want to realize that, is you live in a city, you're in the night, in the night in the city, and then you go outside of the city. This about 3 to 5 centigrade is exactly what you feel, which is quite a lot. So we have two greenhouse effects, the natural one and the anthropogenic one, and we are talking at the moment about the anthropogenic one, which is an additional one. I would like to recommend you to look on maybe on the ministry in Indonesia. I think if there is a Ministry of Environment, there will be a website or something which is explaining the causes about the greenhouse effect. So I think there are enough material which in order to go deeply about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So this is the last question. Come from Firda Berlianti Sarmidi. What things that can we do as a young generation to convince people that global warming could make a big impact for their life? Thank you.
Simple language, understandable language, and good examples where the people can realize that. I think communication is the issue. Of course, we have skeptics and we have deniers, but I think we have to continue further to communicate with that. I don't think that it's the appropriate strategy and way to show all the negative impacts and so people from heat are dying or lying in the hospitals and so on. But I think we need an appropriate and very good communication.
Okay, thank you very much. So the communication is the point, important point to do the, yes, and then
I think we have scientifically we know a lot, but I think in the future we have to focus on communication and education.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Andreas Matsaragis, for our discussion. So allow me to summarize. The global warming is the condition that cannot be changed, and then the climate change will be impact the urban climate change, and then it will be make the climate parameters such as heat that can affect the health of the society, and this condition can produce the condition of the heat health warming, especially in elderly and then in public or in nursing homes. And then there are some of several modern thermal index such as PET, yes, PET, the physiological equivalent temperature, and also we have do some action in short term and long term in education and communication with people in our country. So thank you very much for such a good presentation and then our discussion. Hope we can still meet in another upcoming conference. And one more, thanks a lot for your sharing your expertise. And then good morning for you, Professor Dr. Andreas. And I will give to Master Ceremony, Mr. Ubat. Thank you very much. See you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's once again give a big round of applause to both Professor Andreas and also Ibu Pipit for such an informative presentation as well as insightful discussion. So many questions. It was flooding. I mean, the Slido was flooded by so many questions. And thank you so much for your patience, Dr. Andres, to answer the question one by one, even though some of the questions required us a whole semester to answer. Well, as a token of appreciation for the organizing committee, there will be certificate virtually presented first to Professor Andres by the head section of International Program of Directorate of International Affairs, Ibu Dr. Nia Nafisa. So I would like to invite Ibu Dr. Nia Nafisa to virtually present the certificate to Professor Andreas.
Hello. Yeah, on behalf of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, I would like to present the certificate of recognition to Professor Andreas Patzarakis for a very insightful, informative presentation today. Thank you very much, Professor Andreas Patzarakis. And thank you.
Yeah, and the second certificate will be virtually presented by Ibu Nia to today's moderator, Ibu Dr. Pipit Pitriani. So I would like to invite both. I would like to invite Ibu Nia to virtually present the certificate to Ibu Pipit.
And the second certificate of recognition would like to be given to Dr. Pipit Pitriani for moderating today's session. It was very nice of you, Dr. Pipit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Nia, for virtually handing the certificate gracefully. Ladies and gentlemen, now that both the presentation and the discussion have just ended, it's time for me, Ubat, as your Master of Ceremony, to sign off. But before that, I would like to again remind you that we still have some upcoming webinars. The nearest one is going to be tomorrow, November 17th. moderated by Professor Dr. Phil Ari Widodo, MED. Further details on each of the webinar series can be found on DIA Instagram account, that is at dia.up, dia.upi. So make sure that you follow and check it out, including the registration link. So, ladies and gentlemen, I believe this is the end of our session for today's fourth International Distinguished Scholar Webinar Series World Class University Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. It's time to part ways. So, I am Ubad, your Master of Ceremony for today's webinar, signing off. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express my most sincere gratitude, especially to over 500 participants joining us today. 600 participants joining today for your enthusiastic participation, and my apologies again on behalf of the organizing committee for the inconvenience. So everybody please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay happy. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a great day, everybody.
Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia is located in Bandung, West Java. Living in Bandung means students and scholars will experience vibrant, warm, and progressive city environment. Bandung offers high-quality environment for students and scholars' living standards, starting from academic support facilities, natural and man-made recreational facilities, achievable transportations, and ample green open spaces. In Indonesia, Bandung is popular for its nickname, Kota Kembang or the City of Flower. Since decades ago, Bandung has always been known for its lovely weather because of the trees along the way, and known to be a beautiful city because of its famous ornamental flower varieties. Then, how to get more information regarding studying at UP or joining UP international events? Here at UP's Directorate of International Affairs will be pleasure to assist you. Directorate of International Affairs, which was formerly known as the Office of International Education and Relation, is an office at Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia whom handles all international relations. DIA aims to support the internationalization goals of the university and to manage international mobility involving local and international students, faculty members, and other academics relations. As a university with a jargon leading and outstanding, UP has actively collaborated with many universities from all over the world, such as Philippines, Japan, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Germany, United Kingdom, Taiwan, South Korea, Uzbekistan, Finland, Canada, and many more. With experiences in working with various countries around the world, DIA will assist and serve all international students and prospective students without any differences. International students will be also helped by the presence of DIA student bodies, who will be helping them to adapt while studying at UP and living in Bandung. Therefore, international students will have no difficulty adopting here. There are many programs that have been held by DIA UP. For scholars, there are international faculty programs and visiting scholars, which connect foreign lecturers and UP academic community. For international students, there are various programs that you can be involved in and be a part of UP's community. There are C-Teacher, Mahasiswa Republik Indonesia Scholarship Program, KNB Scholarship Program, Summer Program, International Student Bodies Virtual Summit, International Culinary Days, and many more. And don't worry, for UP students, we also have special programs for you. If you want to study abroad or study culture-related course, student exchange is the answer. We have PPL Sekolah Indonesia Luar Negeri, student internship, summer program, and international culinary days. So, what are you waiting for? Just follow our social media on Instagram at dia.up, visit our website at www.dia.up.edu, and contact us through email dia@up.edu to find more information. We are waiting for your participation in our programs.